I do want to push back on what David was saying about essentially saying that this is a problem that came from the Democratic side. And I would hope that we could take a little time off before we get to this. But the rhetoric out of the Republican side, out of Donald Trump himself.
She's back. Liberal Fox News commentator and fan favorite of pondering politics, Jessica Tarlov, returned from maternity leave and pushed back on her right-wing MAGA Fox News co-hosts when they suggested that Democrats are somehow responsible for violent rhetoric. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, there has been obviously an onslaught of bad news in American politics, particularly for those of us in the anti-Republican, pro-democracy coalition. But we do have some good news, and that is Jessica Tarlov is back. The voice of sanity, the powerhouse, the one who's constantly fending off bad faith, dishonest MAGA talking points on the Fox News network. She is back from maternity leave. She is at the Republican National Convention, and she was on hand in the aftermath of the assassination attempt against Donald Trump to push back on the dishonest right-wing talking point that somehow the left and Democrats are primarily and singularly responsible for the violent rhetoric which courses through the nation. This is what she had to say.
Border, it's focusing on crime.
The themes of his campaign.
Yeah.
Which, that totally makes sense to me. But I do want to push back on what David was saying about essentially saying that this is a problem that came from the Democratic side. And I would hope that we could take a little time off before we get to this. But the rhetoric out of the Republican side, out of Donald Trump himself or Don Jr. about the attack on Paul Pelosi, mocking him, making up a rumor that this was some gay sex event, right? And wasn't a terrible attack by someone who was politically motivated and could have taken his life. No. That is the genesis of this. This goes back to 2016.
So the reason I want to focus on this, of course, a couple of things. Number one, Jess is clearly a fan of pondering politics, right? Because she is echoing sentiments that I made in a video yesterday. But the reason that I find what she does so impressive, I say she has the hardest job in mainstream legacy media because she is in the lion's den. She is outnumbered. She is in front of millions of people who hate her guts. I mean, you should see the verbal abuse that this woman gets by pushing back on MAGA talking points. But also think about it. She's returned from maternity leave, right? So she's fresh again, essentially, in terms of like she's had months off, right? So she hasn't been in the trenches. So this is her first appearance back at the Republican National Convention in front of millions of people who despise her views, surrounded by hosts who radically and ideologically disagree with her. And again, think about what she's saying. She has the courage to push back in all of that, physically and through space, right? Because again, she is at the Republican National Convention, right? This is the cult meeting of the GOP. And she has the courage and honesty to look everyone in the face and say, hey, listen, this isn't the Democrats' fault. This is in the aftermath of a failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump, right? So the stakes just couldn't be higher. And it would be so easy for someone in her position to fold, like many other replacements or temporary stand-ins for Jessica Tarlov on the Five that we've been subjected to for the past several months, most of them not having the backbone and grit that she does. But despite all of these circumstances, she has the honesty to say, no, it's revisionist history and dishonest to suggest that Democrats are somehow singularly or even primarily responsible for this, that actually the violent rhetoric and the amusement and downplaying of violence is much more manifest in the Republican Party, in the MAGA movement, and from Donald Trump. I'll also remind you, based on what we know, before I play this next clip as an example, the shooter, the attempted assassin of Donald Trump, based on investigation, he was a registered Republican, and his classmates say he was pretty conservative. Food for thought. But this is the clip that Jessica was talking about when she referred to Donald Trump publicly mocking the assault on Paul Pelosi, an 80-something-year-old man who was married to Speaker Pelosi, by a mentally disturbed far-right lunatic who was trying to attack and assassinate Pelosi and instead attacked her husband when Pelosi wasn't home. This is how Donald Trump responded.
And we'll stand up to crazy Nancy Pelosi, who ruined San Francisco. How's her husband doing, by the way? Anybody know? And she's against building a wall at our border, even though she has a wall around her house, which obviously didn't do a very good job.
And also know, again, for what it's worth, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of people in the audience laughing at that. And listen, you can have a dark sense of humor. If you want to joke about these things, that's your prerogative, right? A joke is a joke. Could be in poor taste. But the bottom line is this. Imagine how Republicans and MAGA cultists would respond if and when prominent Democrats responded with humor at what happened to Trump. They would be appalled. They might also threaten violence. But that actually hasn't happened. President Biden, prominent Democratic leaders have consistently, quickly, and unequivocally condemned the violence and haven't joked about it. There's a colossal asymmetry here. Jessica Tarlov also pointed out, again, the difference, like Don Jr., and I mentioned this in a previous video too. Don Jr., Donald Trump Jr.'s son, in response to the attack on Paul Pelosi, where he was cracked over the head with a hammer, he says, "I got my Paul Pelosi Halloween costume ready, a pair of dirty underwear and a hammer." He did that publicly. Responds, Paul Pelosi's husband, Nancy Pelosi, arch nemesis or one of the arch nemeses of Donald Trump. This is how she responded publicly when Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. As one whose family has been the victim of political violence, I know that firsthand that violence of any kind has no place in our society. I thank God that former President Trump is safe. Sorry for the burp there. As we learn details about this horrifying incident, let us pray that all those in attendance at the former president's rally today are unharmed. So you see the contrast, the staggering contrast, which shows how depraved that prominent Republicans are. Food for thought. I'll also point out that it's not just the likes of Don Jr., it's not just the likes of Donald Trump, it's not just the likes of prominent Republicans. Some of Jessica Tarlov's own Fox News co-hosts or co-employees like Rachel Campos Duffy, this is how she referenced the Paul Pelosi attack months afterwards. This was back in May of this year. That's how recent this was. Listen to how she responded.
How about the guys that cleared out Columbia? I'd like to add them too. Whatever you, I mean, but it's probably more likely to go to Paul Pelosi, Susan Rice, and Gavin Newsom. So I think your list is correct, but a little off-brand for Big Joe. Rachel?
Yeah. Well, maybe Paul Pelosi needs the hammer instead of the metal.
Well, it's metal.
They're referring to Nancy Pelosi receiving a Presidential Medal of Honor. And then she's saying, you know what? Maybe Paul Pelosi doesn't need a medal. Maybe he needs a hammer, the very tool that was used to nearly kill him by a far-right lunatic. And she's laughing, by the way. And again, whatever. If you have a dark sense of humor, you are free. You are legally at liberty to joke about these sorts of things. But the hypocrisy and the pearl clutching is what annoys me. If you don't want to joke about those things, that's fine. Don't joke about any of it. If you are going to joke about it, then don't clutch your pearls and whine when other people joke about harm being done to people you like. And you just know that these people couldn't handle that. The MAGA Republicans, Rachel Campos Duffy, if a prominent Democrat joked, or if an MSNBC host joked about what happened to Donald Trump, she'd be weeping on air. By the way, one of the things that she talks about the most is how devoutly religious she is, devoutly Christian, and how much she, reflects the teachings of Jesus Christ, who is well known for mocking people who were subject to violence. But people have been writing about this, like Parker Malloy, Mehdi Hassan, in really good Substack articles. And what they've noticed is, and what they've observed is just, it's true. There is a staggering asymmetry which is imposed, certainly by the Republicans and by conservatives, on Democrats and liberals, but also, quite frankly, by independents, by centrists, by the mainstream media. They grade Republicans, particularly in the Trump era, on a curve. And as you know, one of the recurring theses of this channel is, I reject that, and I think you should too. The answer is no. We're going to all adhere to a single standard. Pick one, and then you actually need to live up to it too. If we give well wishes and thoughts and prayers to people who are subject to political violence and Republicans, you need to do the same thing. When Democrats, prominent Democrats, and their spouses and their loved ones are attacked or threatened, you need to do the same thing. Don't joke about it. Give your thoughts and prayers. Condemn the violence. And if it's not okay to joke about that sort of thing when it happens to Republicans, then you don't need to joke about it when it happens to Democrats. So good on Jessica Tarlov for being there to push back, especially in this harrowing time when conventional wisdom and all the internal, external pressures would probably be driving her to not say anything at all. She finds the courage of her convictions to say, no, this is stupid. Despite everything that happened, We're not going to indulge in this revisionist history. Donald Trump, yes, was subject to inexcusable political violence, but we're not going to whitewash him and pretend that he is not the single greatest source of incivility in American politics, because he is. Let me know what you think in the comments.